don't be afraid to fail will be the main thing, because I was so afraid of failing and worrying about what other people thought about me in my early years in terms of all the writing I was doing. And like, who cares?
Jonathan Small is an award-winning author, journalist, producer, and podcast host. He has worked as a multimedia storyteller for such top media companies as The New York Times, Hearst, and Condé Nast. He has held executive roles at Glamour, Stuff, and Entrepreneur, and regularly contributes to The New York Times, TV Guide, Cosmo, Details, Maxim, and Good Housekeeping. How's that for variety? He joins me today on Uncorking a Story to talk about his career and new book, Right About Now. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks, Mike.
Jonathan,
thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you here, and I'm curious, where does your story as an author begin?
As an author, I would say, let's flash back in our time machines. 1990, I'm a receptionist at a magazine, a fledgling parenting magazine called Child Magazine. I am only a receptionist there because it's a temp job. Didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up at that time. I think I'm 21 years old, and I am sitting there basically answering the phone, and an editor comes running out and says, John, we have an emergency. You like to write, right? I said, well, I've done a little writing, but not much. She said, well, we've got this interview we need to do with George Carlin, and nobody in the staff can do it. And he's going to call in a half an hour. And we're wondering if you can just interview him and write a story based on the interview. And I was like, what, George Carlin, who's like my idol at the time, or somebody, not my idol, but certainly somebody that I really admired. And, I was really into stand-up comedy and always have been. And I said, okay, I guess I have no choice. I have to do this because otherwise I'm going to lose my job. So I agreed to do this interview. It was a total, there was no internet at the time, so I couldn't go online and do my George Carlin and stuff, quick George Carlin research. So I just kind of winged it. It went well. I wrote up a story. They liked the story. They gave me a job as editorial assistant eventually, which is the sort of lowest rung of the food chain, and the writing career kind of began there. That's sort of the origin of that particular writing track.
Just a couple of questions there. Number one, like you're saying you're a receptionist at a fledgling magazine, and my head goes right to David Spade and Just Shoot Me. Do you remember
exactly?
That show?
Totally.
That's what I'm picturing.
That was probably the same era too that show kind of came out around. That was when actually people, like cool people were, or, where magazines were actually kind of cool, or they actually existed at all, right? I always have to explain to people who were like millennials or Gen Z, there was a time when magazines were like the thing, the place to work.
Oh my gosh. And then if you worked in advertising, like I started my career in the mid 90s in advertising. And back then, you didn't get paid anything for being a media planner, really.
Right.
But your benefits were the magazines would throw parties. And, you got to go to, the Sports Illustrated party or the Forbes, you go on the Forbes yacht or something like that. Because the books, as they would call them, they had money to spend and entertain these.
Fledgling later in my career, I would go on to work at Maxim and Stuff magazines, and they had some really fun parties. At the time, they took over the Santa Monica Pier. They just bought out the Santa Monica Pier and invited every celebrity you could ever imagine, and that was incredible. So yes, those were the glory days.
So I got when I was younger, when I was first married, we had one of these kids like canvassing the neighborhood, selling magazine subscriptions. And, I really didn't want a magazine, but, I felt bad for the kid because they give you the sob story, right? Like, oh, I'm putting myself through college, this and that. So I'm like, fine. So I got Maxim magazine.
Oh boy.
Every month it would wind up in the garbage. And I'd be like, what? Why is this magazine? And it was my wife. We just got married, and she would throw that magazine away every single
you're not
month
looking at this one.
She's like, oh, this is just like porn. I'm like, it's not porn. This is like a men's magazine. There's no nudity in it. I mean, it's close, but
that was an era of time. It's certainly, I feel like it couldn't really exist right now, or maybe in our Trump world it could exist, but certainly not in the last 5 years, where there was a need for that type of magazine. Men really gravitated. At the time, there was only, before Maxim came to the U.S., there was only like Esquire and GQ, Sports Illustrated. Those were like the magazines that men were supposed to read. And somebody had the idea, first in London, they were called laddie magazines. The guys, they wanted to look at pretty girls and wanted to learn about drinking and stuff, but they didn't want to be like Playboy. They didn't want it to be explicit, so they could possibly read it on an airplane or, exactly have that mailed to their home. And so these laddie magazines came along, and that's when I came on the scene. But before that, I had been working for women's magazines my entire career. It was like a revelation for me, because I came to Stuff magazine, which was one of those magazines from Glamour magazine. So I went from the most like feminine magazine to like the most like masculine testosterone magazine. It was a real shift for me.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I remember one article, I can't remember if it was like Stuff or Details or Maxima, but I remember reading it in college. It was about how to be a good wingman. And I'm like, this is really good information. Like, it was
right.
like, my 20 or 18-year-old brain was like, wow, this is invaluable. Now
that's a great story idea. I think those magazines definitely served a purpose. I remember even like checking to see, if you have bad breath. I never forget the tip of, do you have bad breath? And it was, you have to lick your wrist and smell it. And if your wrist stinks, you better get a toothbrush or get a Certs in there. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes those magazines do get a bad rap because everybody just remembers, the scantily clad women in the magazine. That was part of it. But honestly, they had a lot of like good life advice, and there was some good writing in there. And of course, nobody who worked at those magazines was at all what you would think it would be. Like, you imagine these like frat guys, high-fiving around the keg, but it was actually a bunch of Harvard graduates and, kind of like nerdy, journalist types that were just there. So I've often wanted to write like a memoir about that time in my life, but maybe someday.
Someday. Well, the other thing I'm curious about is George Carlin. So what's he doing, like calling into doing a phoner with a magazine called Child Magazine?
Yeah, well, this is how
angle there.
Yeah, this is how old I am. People might not remember this, but he actually was on Thomas the Tank Engine in the early episodes of that show. He played the conductor in the show Thomas the Tank Engine, and so that show was launching, and he was getting publicity, and Child Magazine had a section that was sort of like new. It was for parents, so it had like new shows for your kids to watch, kind of stuff. So it was a publicity tour kind of thing.
Got it. I remember Ringo Starr was involved with that too, wasn't he?
He was. You're totally right. That's just coming back to me. He was like in there somewhere. I can't remember what.
I think he was the narrator. He may have been the narrator.
Yeah, maybe Thomas. Yeah, exactly.
And I remember him saying the fat conductor, and I'm like, wow, we're fat shaming action figures now.
Again, could not get away with that in 2024. Nowhere 25. Yeah.
As you pointed out, rules may be changing, so you never know.
Never bet anything out. It's funny because I just got a call from Maxim magazine recently to do an article. I mean, they still exist. I couldn't believe it. I didn't even know it still was around. Yeah. So they're around. They've had to reinvent themselves. They're now kind of more of like a upscale lifestyle magazine and not what they used to be. So
the Carlin interview gets your feet wet, kind of
gets my feet wet,
doing some writing. And how do we progress to where you are now? Let's fill in the blanks for me there.
Well, there's a few steps, and where I am now is so far from where I was then in terms of having to pivot so many times in my career. But as far as the writing goes, one of the advantages in those days of working at a magazine like, in an office as opposed to working remotely, as I was working, I shared a floor with YM magazine, which was a young and modern, or young miss, depending on what time you picked up the magazine. It was Young Miss at first. And anyway, it was a teen magazine. And I would sort of hang out, after work with some of the women that worked at that magazine because they were cool, unlike the dowdy parents that I work with over in the Child magazine. We would talk about dating and stuff, and they would like my little takes on dating. So they started giving me assignments to write, on the side for YM magazine. So I started writing a lot of advice, kind of relationship, type stories, from a guy's perspective. And they thought that was really fun. And that got me in the door at YM. And then I started getting on the radar of other, editors. Another nice thing, and I always tell people, like, don't burn bridges in any business, certainly not in the publishing business, do not burn bridges, because you just never know when these people are going to resurface. So all those, young women who ended up, becoming my friends when I was in my early 20s, they would go on to get these kind of great jobs at different magazines, and they bring me on to those magazines. So it was a lot of kind of those kind of lucky breaks where, one of the editors ended up at Fitness Magazine. So I ended up getting a job at Fitness Magazine. And then I ultimately would get a job at a magazine called Twist, which was a teen magazine. And then, so I kept getting kind of working my way up the editorial ladder, senior editor, executive, till I eventually ended up, after about 7 years of that, of just kind of working my way up and always writing for all these different magazines and moonlighting for other magazines, ended up, the last job I ever had in publishing was the executive editor of Stuff Magazine. But before I even got to Stuff Magazine, I was at Glamour Magazine, where I wrote this sort of, I guess, the epitome of all advice columns. I wrote the Jake column. And Jake is for any woman maybe listening of a certain age listening to this episode, Jake was a columnist. He's sort of a legendary columnist for Glamour Magazine who answers questions for women about, dating and relationships. So I kind of carved out this niche for myself. It's kind of ridiculous now in retrospect, because I had no business giving anybody advice about dating. I mean, I was a disaster. And my wife makes fun of me because she's a therapist. And so she's like, how the heck did you get that job? Like, you had no business. Like, I'm a certified therapist. I have a degree. I was like, I know, I feel guilty now. In fact, I was thinking about doing an episode where I read some of my old columns and my wife critiques my advice, because I don't know how good it was. Although we were married, we were dating around I eventually would get a job at Cosmo, also writing their advice column, and my wife would help me with that one. So she was helpful. But so it was really like, in the beginning for me, it was magazine writing all the way up until Stuff Magazine. And then I just decided, I sort of saw the writing on the wall that maybe magazines weren't going to last forever, certainly not print magazines. And I was getting a little burnt out anyway. And I moved to LA and I took a job with a film production company that a friend was starting, a very kind of crazy move, because I was making pretty good salary and I had a good life in New York. And I just decided to drop it all and move to California with my cat and, take half the salary and work in a different industry. And would end up just pivoting throughout my career to kind of always, the writing was always the underpinning of everything I did. But I would, I ended up working for YouTube, but doing writing and producing and editing for them. And then I ended up working at the Game Show Network. And so I've had to kind of make a lot of pivots in my career to kind of stay afloat. But thankfully, I learned early on, thanks to George Carlin, how to write, how to construct a sentence, how to think creatively. And that has, been a benefit up until, now I've got the threat of AI. Every time I think that I've figured it out, something else, some new technology will come that's just about to unseat me again. The web took me the first time around, or tried to take me out. And now I got AI to contend with. And we all do, I guess.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yep. For as helpful as it can be. It's
super helpful, and I've embraced AI. I'm not I'm not a Luddite about AI. I'm very into AI. I just think that right now it's nowhere. I teach a class on working with AI, collaborating with the AI, and I think you have to, at this point in your career as a writer, learn how to work, because it's going to be mandatory as part of your job requirement. And it's not quite good enough yet to replace us, but who knows where it's going.
Well, tell me about the genesis of the book, Right About Now.
So I have a podcast, much like yours, called Right About Now, in which I interview writers about their work, about their careers, about their process. And I'd always wanted to kind of do a spin-off book, but I got busy with life and just didn't do it. And one day, credit to my wife, we were kind of thinking out loud, like, if I were to do a book, based on these, 300 interviews that I've done over the last 5 years, what would be the topic? And she said, well, one thing that people always, comment on, that I've noticed, like in your comments and stuff, is people like the origin stories of like some of the writers that you've had on the show. Like, how did they, like exactly what you asked in the beginning of this podcast. I frequently do the same thing where I'll ask a writer how they got started. And there were some pretty good stories. If I went through the 300 stories, there was a good collection, a good mix of stories of all types. And I just decided, why don't I just curate those I'll tell my own story. I'll talk about why I think origin stories are important. And, I realize that was actually sometimes the part that I like the most of the interviews myself, because I think I'm a bit of a sucker for a good origin story. I mean, look at popular media today. It's all origin stories, right? It's how did this superhero get his start or her start, and so there's always origin stories are very interesting, I think, to people. And so I thought let's start with the writers. Maybe eventually I'll do another book about origin stories of different types of people, but let's start with what I got, and I did that. So that's the genesis of that idea, and I'm glad I did it.
That's very cool, and it's something that I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it either. I mean, I'm
Oh, great.
hitting on like 400 episodes.
Oh, wow.
Predominantly with authors, although there's a couple of other kind of storytellers in there too. But it's like, because people, a lot of people say, "Hey, I want to write a book."
Right.
Everybody feels like they've got a book in them. I think anyway. Like everybody feels like they can do it, and I've got all these insights into, how people, where did their writing story begin? Where did their journey begin as an author? And I've been noticing that, because I'm a researcher by training, and I've been seeing these patterns in the stories that I've been uncorking. It's all driven by, this powerful curiosity. Right, is one thing that all these authors have in common, and it's not even just the curiosity; it's then the itch that they scratch to take that curiosity and do something with it. That like most mortals don't do. Most mortals don't walk into their hotel room, seeing their maid holding their a chambermaid holding their sweatpants, and then writing a friggin' best-selling novel about it. But I had an author who did that.
That's wild.
It's just it's crazy.
I mean, the choice to write a book is really insanity. I mean, think about what, you're going to be now. You're choosing to spend, maybe a year or so by yourself working on this thing that might not make you any money. Most likely the odds are will maybe lose you money, right? You're writing to an audience that doesn't exist. You're just in your own space. And yet you're driven by some passion that you have to have in order to write a book, certainly a novel. I will say that's next on my bucket list is my novel. And of course, not to say that I haven't started 10 novels that I haven't finished. But yeah, I just marvel at the people I have on my show that have actually finished their stories. And despite having every reason to quit, like, some of the most successful writers I've had on the show had like agents tell them that they like, this is terrible, or, like you might want to not quit your day job kind of things. And they still persevered for some reason.
Well, yeah.
And so I thought that's inspiring to me. Yeah.
That's the other crazy thing about that decision to write a book is, it's going to take at least a year.
Right.
Especially your first time out. And over time, it might get shorter. But you're also not going to make a whole lot of money, most likely, right? To your point, it might cost you something. And then you're going to face a lot of rejection. I mean, just going through the querying process alone is one of the more humbling processes you can go through. But then you get a story like, who is it? Andy Weir, who wrote The Martian, who gets rejected, says, screw you, I'm self-publishing this. And then boom, it's a great success story. It's like stories like that is amazing. Yeah.
Andy Weir was one of my favorite stories because he was just kind of like he was doing it as a fun kind of hobby to his writing. Didn't really not thinking anybody was reading his stuff. He just wanted to put it out in the world. He had no ambition to like be who he is now. Initially, I don't remember what his job was, but he definitely was not a writer. Was definitely not an author when he was writing The Martian. And then people kind of found it. This is still in the age of blogging, and they found it, and then they eventually asked him like, it's kind of hard to read it in the way you have it set up. Is there any way you could put it into like one book format? And so he kind of like put it into like an Amazon ebook, and then gave it away for free, and then realized he could start charging for it eventually. And then a publisher discovered that he was selling all these ebooks, and gave him a book deal, and the rest is history. But yeah, it was just driven by a passionate, a sort of need to do it. And like you said, a curiosity. In his case, that was what interested in him, that question of like, how could somebody survive that was stuck on Mars? And he's so good because his stuff is funny, but it's also really really well researched. Like he want to put out sci-fi that didn't have truth in it, right? So he really researched that and thought about that and did his so it comes across as really accurate. Another guy in the book that's actually a friend of mine is this guy Max Brooks, who wrote World War Z, and it's the same thing. Like he didn't want to put that book out until he knew that this is like kind of feasible. Like even though it's about a zombie apocalypse, it had to feel real, right? And so he did so much research into what might happen if there was a zombie apocalypse. And he never starts a book without doing a tremendous amount of research. But in the case of Max Brooks, I mean, here he is. He's Max Brooks is Mel Brooks's son, right? Everybody anointed him as the sort of next Mel Brooks, the next, and that really wasn't. He loved to write, and he was smart like his dad, but didn't want to write comedy. But everybody just pigeonholed him in that role. And then so when he put out World War Z, everybody thought that he was making a joke, like it was like a sort of a parody of like this stuff, and it was marketed that way at first. And it turned out that was a huge mistake, and it didn't do well at first because it was marketed as a comedy book, and that offended the sort of real zombie, people out there, the real zombie fans. And when Max kind of told everybody, look, this is not a joke. I'm serious about this. This is like, I think about this stuff, and this is like, you're me, and went on some podcast and explained to people what he was really doing. Then it took off. He when he reframed it, but yeah. I mean, that book was just written as a labor of love. He did not think that was going to be a commercial success.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough when your dad writes like History of the World Part 1.
Yeah. That's your dad. That's your legacy. That's your dad. I know. I mean, and
he's comicus.
It's amazing. And he's kind of carved out his own thing. It has nothing to do with anything his dad would ever do. So I admire that because I know, living in LA here, I do know the kids of some famous people, and it doesn't always work out so well for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah. What are some of the things that some of the characteristics of authors that you've noticed are kind of similar, coming out of just the sheer number of interviews you've done? What similarities have you noted?
Well, I mean, it seems obvious now, but they do love to read. Right. It's funny that a lot of people want to get into writing, but don't actually read. Like they say they want to be writers, but then you say, well, what books do you read? Well, I don't really read books. And I'm like, how can you write if you don't read? So it seems like an obvious characteristic, but great writers tend to read a lot. And not all of them are like voracious readers, but they appreciate writing. And I remember I was interviewing Joyce Maynard, who and she was saying that she actually doesn't read as many books as you would imagine that she does because she's dyslexic. But she does she does keep up on what's out there. She's interested in books. She loves walking into bookstores. Like she has a curiosity and a passion about storytelling. I think they love to tell stories. They're generally great storytellers, either in person or obviously on the page. I think, let me see what else. I mean, the one thing you can't underestimate is that they have a bit of luck, right? I think that people who are successful in writing there's always one part of their career, just like I was assigned to, was sitting at a desk and somebody asked me to write about George Carlin randomly. They have some moment in their career where they get a little bit of a lucky break. And I think I don't know. I feel like you can't underestimate that. And you should know that like this could happen to you too, as a writer. It's not going to it never goes exactly the way you plan it's going to go. Like you never can map out your successful, I'm going to write this book and this is going to happen. And then this is going to happen. And, only in retrospect does it flow like that. But actually, in a lot of cases, it's like I did this book and then the right person happened to notice it in a slush pile. And then all of a sudden, I got a call and, it's just, there's so much luck involved.
Yeah. I mean, you have to have the talent, right? You've got to tell a good story, but luck is there too, because your story's got to come out at the right time. Like there's a time and a place for everything, but so much of it is, hey, getting in front of, that agent or junior agent's eyes at the right time when something relevant is happening, kind of in the, in the universe.
Right. I mean, they're also, like you said, they have a curiosity and they're not eventually they get over this fear of jumping into the unknown, because writing a book is really like the hero's journey of like that, taking that step into the unknown. And that's why I think origin stories, are so interesting, because it is kind of does follow a bit of the hero's journey trajectory, where it's like you are now in the unknown, you're in the unknown world. You have no idea what's going to happen. Hopefully you'll slay some dragons, and return a different person. And so a lot of them kind of overcome that fear, and they're the ones. And again, you might not even be successful and write a book, but you have, you might not be successful commercially, whatever, but you're successful, I think, as a person, just as somebody that's overcome a fear and just stepped into the unknown. And I think that is something that you can credit all authors with doing.
Yeah. Another thing I've noticed is, the difference between like book one and book two, right? So book one typically isn't contracted, right? You're shopping that around.
Right.
And book two, it might be, once you sell book one, maybe it's part of a 2-book deal. But the difference is, nobody asked for that first book, but now that second book all of a sudden has a deadline against it. And it might be a lot shorter, right? It's scary, and you got to kind of get over that. Okay, that imposter syndrome might sneak in. Like, am I supposed to be here? And I hear that a lot from authors too. The sophomore jinx is like a real thing. I don't think Andy Weir's second book was a huge success. It just happens, but he's had books that have been successful after The Martian. I think the things I asked my listeners, like, what are the things that most hold you back from writing? I did some poll, and procrastination was the first one. And then it was fear of failure. And then it was what we're talking about here, this kind of imposter syndrome, where it's like, I will be revealed for being the fraud I am. All my life I've said I'm a writer. And then people will say like, well, you're not really a writer. You just kind of got lucky, So I thought that was interesting, that those are kind of the three hurdles that a lot of writers face. And the nice, refreshing thing I'm going to tell anybody listening to this is that no matter what level of success you're at, you still have these concerns. Because I will always ask my most successful, I'm sure you do the same thing, I'll ask the most successful people, on my show, like, do you still have fear of failure? Like, of course I fear, I worry that. And they're still jealous of other writers, and they still, they have all the things that people starting out have. It's just magnified or through a different lens. So, I don't think there's anybody that writes, and I wouldn't trust anybody that writes that doesn't have that little voice in the back of their head saying, you suck. Right, you're terrible. This is the worst sentence anybody's ever written. Nobody's going to like this. It's always there. Yeah, that in the back of your mind, having something to prove, always having something to prove, that's like fuel. And it's interesting. I interviewed a best-selling author right before the holidays. His 46th book was coming out. I mean, this guy has sold probably 40 million books. I mean, one of the biggest medical thriller
Can we name?
writers.
Does this person have a name?
His name is Robin Cook.
Oh, yeah. Pretty famous.
Pretty famous. But at the end of the interview, off air, he's like, hey, can I give you my cell phone number? I need you to tell me what you think of the book. And I'm like, so this guy is looking to focus group out.
Wow. That is crazy.
With some idiot he just met. I'm not really an idiot. I mean, most of the time I'm less of an idiot, but but to me, that's, I think, the difference between authors and other types of creators or entertainers. It's like they really are looking for that kind of feedback.
Well, and they don't, if you're an actor, right, you go on stage, immediately what your feedback is. Like, you get your audience is either laughing, and you can feel it. You go to a movie theater, you can watch your performance, you can. But like, for writers, you put this thing out there. I mean, I feel the same thing with podcasting. You can put this thing out there. You don't really know what people think. I mean, they might write you, letters and stuff, but it's not like you get that immediate kind of like validation or response. It's a different type of experience. I remember when I wrote a play in college, that was like I should have just stick to playwriting, because that was an amazing experience to actually like write something and then have it performed and like see people in real time responding to the words that you wrote, as opposed to like putting it on a page and then just like putting it out in the universe and having no idea what anybody thinks, except for the occasional, like, either negative or positive comment on Amazon. Yeah.
No, I feel the same way. Like my early books were all comedies.
Mm,
and or like comedic mysteries. And as a comedy writer, you want to hear the laughs, right? So
right.
that, and you don't do that when you're writing long form. So then I started doing stand up. I just, like 5 years ago,
Right.
I'm like, you know what? I just want to know if these things I create get laughs or not. And
Yeah.
it's like so addictive,
I
when you
can
get
see
that
why. I'm
dopamine
really
hit.
impressed. I'm really impressed that you do stand up. I've thought about it because I did theater when I was in college, and I really did enjoy that, that immediate. I mean, I think this is why stand up comics are addicted to stand up, because it's like that feeling, like right there, a visceral feeling of like, oh, people really are reacting to this. But writing is so like empty. And I always want to be like, I want to tell people like, can I run this one line by you just to see if you like it? But I know I can't. I'd drive all my friends crazy if I did that. So you're
Yeah.
just kind of like, you're a one man audience.
Getting when you went through and put your book together, kind of after that conversation you had with your therapist wife,
Hmm.
um, what, if anything, did you learn about yourself? I mean, obviously, you're going through and you're revisiting all those interviews you did,
Yeah.
but going through the process of putting it together and writing it into a narrative, what did you learn about yourself, Jonathan?
That's a really good question. I haven't even reflected that much on myself after the experience. I think the one thing I've learned about myself, and just in this whole process of interviewing writers, is that I don't know as much as I thought I did. That I am still always learning, and that and maybe that's a good quality, because I'm not. Maybe I could even be more confident in my own ability as a writer, but like I just feel like these writers teach me so much, like about how to write, about how to be a writer, about how to think about story. And so I guess one of the things I've learned is that I need to be humble sometimes, because I don't, even when I'm feeling like I'm pretty, far on into my career, as a writer, and I know a lot of things about writing, I teach writing, there's always something to learn. Um, I learned that it never, that don't be afraid, um, that life kind of throws you, and I sort of said this earlier, that like it's never a prescribed way, and that even though in your mind you might figure out, well, I'm going to do this and this is going to happen, it doesn't really work out that way in life, and that you really have to put things out there in the universe to see what's going to happen, and that all these kind of stories that I've told myself about why I shouldn't write a novel, say, because I don't have the great American novel in me, or because that's not a good story idea, or because this, I'm so good at excuses, and they're all very legitimate, good excuses. I'm too busy, whatever it is. Like, I'm not a novelist. I'm more of a nonfiction journalist. I have so many stories that I've told myself, and yet all those stories have held me back. And I feel like these people just did it. They just went for it. They didn't know what was going to come about, but they did it. And I find that incredibly inspiring. And so I like to tell myself that, like, if they can do it, I can do it too. And to not make so many excuses. And
Yeah.
so that's definitely been a lesson for me.
Yeah, you've got to get out of your own way sometimes, right?
You got to get out of your own way and just put something out there. And it's funny because I teach that, and then it's like, when push comes to shove, I don't always do it. I'm always like, just write that vomit draft, just write that first draft. I'm always telling people to do stuff, and it's like, oh wait, I'm not doing that. I'm not writing that, first chapter of that novel.
Yeah. Well,
So
it's
yeah.
it's physician heal thyself, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
like, do what do what
Exactly.
I say, don't do as I do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, I'm curious to get to know my guests a little bit more. I sometimes throw some pop culture questions at them,
Oh, of
Jonathan. So
course.
I'm curious, when you were younger, like when you were growing
Mm.
up, what were some of your favorite things to watch on TV?
When I was growing up. Um, I remember loving The White Shadow. I don't know why that just popped into my head. Uh, that show probably would not do well right now.
I don't think so. I think that
No,
would be a little different, right? But
that would be a little different. No, I'm trying to think of some shows that I used to watch when I was growing up. I mean, I loved comedies. I loved like Gilligan's Island. I loved all the kind of like sitcoms when I was really little. And then later, I loved movies like Splash, and I don't know, I always loved kind of magical realism type movies, and I think I still do. I love movies where like you throw a protagonist into a kind of magical situation and see how they respond. E.T., movies like that. And It's in the book, and this is not television, but it's pop culture. I was a very early adapter of rap music. So I'm in my mid 50s, and in the early 80s, rap was just kind of happening in New York. It was sort of coming up, and it's in my book. But in seventh grade, I heard Rapper's Delight for the first time, which is like one of the first raps of all time, right? At least certainly the most sort of cold pop rap. There's a lot of debate about what was the first rap, but that was the one that kind of hit the mainstream. And that's the hip hop. And that rap, I had never heard anything like that in my life. I love music. I've always loved music. And it just blew my mind. And I just became obsessed with rap music. And at the time, it was really, really hard to find rap music. Like there was only a few records, and weren't like pop. There was no radio playing it. And, I just happened to be situated slightly close to the Bronx where all rap was happening. I was in Westchester County, which was like a little bit north of the Bronx in New York geography. And I would like have my father drive me to these kind of neighborhoods in the South Bronx, some dicey neighborhoods. And I would go to these record stores and like buy any like 12-inch vinyl I could find of like rap records, because I was just obsessed with rap. And then I would eventually find my calling as a DJ. I would use my dad's 2 turntables. I got a mixer from Radio Shack, and I learned how to DJ. I learned how to like mix records. Now being a DJ is like almost cliche, but in 1982, there weren't a lot of white kids DJing. It just wasn't a thing. So I was a little bit of a freak to my friends, but they were interested in it. I gave myself a DJ name. I called myself Kid Finesse. And I got really into like that music, into rapping, into writing raps. Eventually I learned how to break dance. I mean, I was like that was a big influence in my younger years. And so can't talk about my younger years without talking about that stuff.
And you can't say the word freak without thinking of The Freaks Come Out at Night.
Oh yeah, Houdini, baby.
That was Houdini. I love that was the first tape. Houdini Escape was the first tape I ever bought. I said tape, not album.
Right. We all had cassettes.
With my own money. Was Houdini.
Oh really?
Yeah.
That was Great. Freak Come Out at Night was great. I love Houdini. Houdini's kind of underrated. I think somebody just died was Houdini one guy? It might have been more than one guy.
Two.
It was 2 guys. One guy just died.
It was
right.
Ecstasy. Oh my gosh, not Grandmaster Flash. I can't remember, but
yeah, that's right. So they one of them just died, but yeah, I love hearing those old stories about the first time people heard rap. And it's interesting. And we were, you said you grew up in the East Coast, so I think we had a little bit more proximity to it early on because it was not really like a national thing until like, I don't know, like the mid 80s or something. So it was still kind of around in the neighborhoods of the East Coast, no matter where you lived. But later it would like, go national. But
yeah.
So yeah, I love that stuff. And what else? Books, I didn't really discover books until later in my life. I was not a big reader as a kid, but in college, I kind of discovered books. And I think I also maybe slightly cliche, but the first time I read Catcher in the Rye, that was when I was like, oh, you can write like this. Like this is the style of writing that you can do that like feels like something I'd want to do.
Yeah, that Holden Caulfield, right?
Holden Caulfield, and just it was written in the first person, and it was such a great voice and such a great character that he created. I would then later go on to interview Joyce Maynard, who I mentioned earlier, who was his lover when he was 50 in his 50s and she was 19, and he totally took advantage of her. And so it kind of took a little bit of the luster from J.D. Salinger from me once I learned kind of what kind of a guy he was, but still he did write a great freaking book. So, and I credit it with getting me interested in writing.
Are those albums behind you over your shoulder there? Yep.
And I've got the Kid Finesse. This is when I went back to my college graduation. They gave me this poster in tribute to my radio show that I used to have there. And so, yeah, it still follows me, the DJing. My son is a DJ, so the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He's 19. He's DJing in London right now. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, he actually might make a living doing it. My parents were like, "You are never going to make a living DJing, so you better learn how to do something else." Which I probably shouldn't have listened to them, but I was maybe a generation too early in the DJing things. I think people after me started like really making a living being a DJ.
Yeah. Did you have all the milk crates? Is that how you?
Oh yeah, I did. I had to lug those things around with me to every middle school and high school dance. But I have gone digital. I know it's kind of like maybe not cool, but I couldn't do it anymore. I still DJ. I mean, I just DJ'd a party the other day, but I now have my board, and I everything is on my computer. But I like to collect the vinyl because it's just fun to have it.
Sure.
And it sounds great.
If you could go back in time and jump in your DeLorean and give your younger self some advice, what would you tell a younger Jonathan?
Oh, don't be afraid to fail and just do what you want to do. Like, don't be afraid to fail will be the main thing, because I was so afraid of failing and worrying about what other people thought about me in my early years in terms of all the writing I was doing. Even DJing, like I was embarrassed sometimes that people would think I was a certain way or whatever. And like, who cares? Now as a 50-year-old man, I'm just like, who cares what other people think? But it seems to matter so much to people when they're starting. And I think if you can break through that and just somehow tell yourself it doesn't matter, just do what you love, do what feels right, do what feels natural to you. Even if it's something that you might fail at or that people are not going to like, it doesn't matter. Go for it. That's the advice I give myself.
Yeah, it seems like when we're younger, we give like way too many fucks. Like we have way too many fucks to give. And as you get older, you give fewer and fewer fucks. And now I look at my dad, who's 92. The man has no fucks left to give. I mean, he just
he's done with his fucks.
Give a fuck.
Right. Yeah, that's good or bad, but it's good. I mean, it's mostly good because what the fuck? I mean, my dad was the same way. It's like, just do whatever the fuck you want to do. I mean, although he said that, but when I was younger, my dad's passed, but he definitely had like an idea of what he wanted me to do in my life. Like it was definitely like he had a sort of a picture, and that influenced me quite a bit. Not that it was a bad picture. My dad was a creative person. My dad was a film composer. So I grew up with a very creative, person in my life, right? And he was always very encouraging of my creativity, but not necessarily specifically with like what I was interested in musically and stuff. But yeah, don't give a fuck. What was that Mark? What's his name? It's not Marin or I don't know, the guy who's the art of not giving a fuck. Or there's a great
the subtle art of not giving a fuck.
Yeah, I wanted to have him on my podcast because I actually like that book. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, I wrote a book called All the Fucks I Cannot Give.
Oh, I love that. I got to find that.
It was based, I mean, it's a comedy. It's based, I got the title from All the Light We Cannot See. And
yes, that's great.
The title hit me. I'm like, what if I wrote a book called All the Fucks I Cannot Give, which was, I didn't have a story. I just had a title.
Right.
And then I found the story after I got unceremoniously fired from a job about 10 years ago. But
you know what? That's sometimes just having the title is enough. I tell people that all the time. Like sometimes the title is that's the first thing people are going to see anyway. We used to, when I was doing magazines writing, we used to come up with the headlines before we came up with the stories, because the headlines are what was selling the magazine. So it's like you had to have good headlines. So let's come up with a headline and then we can write the story retroactively.
Yeah. I mean, the New York Post built a whole business on that.
Exactly.
Those headlines.
And they're still around. They're still around. They're doing well. Yeah. Apparently.
Well, Jonathan, where can people find and pick up a copy of your book Right About Now?
So Right About Now is available at all, but certainly available on all platforms. I have it available in some Barnes and Nobles, but it's probably easier to find it online at Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. It's Right About Now. I also have a podcast called Right About Now you can check out. My website is rightaboutnowmedia.com, but I'm on all the socials. Right About Now Pod. You can find me on Instagram. I'm pretty active on Instagram. I have my last plug here. I have a Substack, which I'm getting kind of more into these days. In fact, right before you called, I was writing my Substack post for this week. And that's called Small Talk. Probably shouldn't be called Small Talk. It'd probably just be called Right About Now because that's on brand. But I wanted to open myself up to not just to write about writing all the time, because I feel like you probably maybe think about this. Sometimes I want to write. I want to talk about stuff other than writing. But anyway, small talk. We talk a lot about writing, but we talk about some other pop culture ideas and stuff like that. That's on my mind.
Yeah, I'll be sure to put all those links in our show notes so people
I
can
appreciate
find
that
them easily without having to write everything down as they're driving or working out or whatever it is they do when they listen to this. And Jonathan, I'll say thank you for stopping by and Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Mike, this was really a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.